May 1st, 2011, the White House Situation Room, Washington, D.C., approximately 1 p.m. Eastern Time. President Barack Obama, 49 years old and midway through his first term, sat at the head of the conference table in the cramped, wood-paneled room surrounded by the most senior national security officials in his administration, including Vice President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, CIA, Director Leon Panetta, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Admiral Mike Mullen, and counterterrorism advisor John Brennan, watching on video screens as two modified Black Hawk helicopters carried 23 Navy SEALs from SEAL Team 6 toward a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, where intelligence analysts believed with varying degrees of confidence that Osama bin Laden, the al-Qaeda leader who had orchestrated the September 11th attacks and who had evaded capture for nearly 10 years, despite being the most hunted man on Earth, was living in hiding, protected by high walls and elaborate security measures that had aroused CIA suspicions, but that had not provided definitive proof that bin Laden was actually present, creating a situation where Obama had authorized high-risk military operation based on circumstantial evidence and analytical judgment rather than on photographic confirmation or signals intelligence that would have provided certainty about target's identity. The tension in the Situation Room was palpable as officials who had spent months analyzing intelligence, debating options, and planning the raid now watched in real time as the operation they had designed unfolded 8,000 miles away in sovereign territory of Pakistan, a nominal American ally whose government had not been informed of the operation because of concerns that elements within Pakistani intelligence services might warn bin Laden or might attempt to interfere with American forces, creating risk of armed confrontation that could have catastrophic consequences for U.S.-Pakistan relations and for regional stability in nuclear-armed South Asia. The context that made this operation so historically significant and so personally consequential for Obama was that killing or capturing bin Laden had been American national security priority since September 11th, 2001, representing both practical necessity of eliminating terrorist leader who continued to inspire attacks against Western targets and symbolic imperative of delivering justice for nearly 3,000 Americans killed in attacks that had transformed American society and American foreign policy. President George W. Bush had famously declared in the immediate aftermath of September 11th that bin Laden would be captured dead or alive. But despite launching war in Afghanistan specifically to destroy al-Qaeda and to punish Taliban for harboring bin Laden, despite committing tens of thousands of American troops and hundreds of billions of dollars to the conflict, and despite CIA's extensive intelligence operations throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan, Bush administration had failed to locate bin Laden or to prevent his escape from Tora Bora in December 2001, when he had slipped across the border into Pakistan before American forces could surround his position. Obama had made finding and eliminating bin Laden a campaign promise during his 2008 presidential race, criticizing Bush administration for allowing attention to shift from Afghanistan to Iraq and for failing to maintain focus on al-Qaeda leadership that actually posed direct threat to American homeland. During presidential debate with John McCain, Obama had stated that if he had actionable intelligence about high-value terrorist targets in Pakistan, and if Pakistani government was unable or unwilling to act, he would authorize American military action to eliminate those threats, even without Pakistani permission. Statement that McCain had criticized as naive and dangerous, but that Obama now had opportunity to implement through the operation unfolding in the Situation Room. The political stakes were enormous because success would vindicate Obama's judgment and would deliver on his campaign promise, while failure could result in American casualties, could damage relations with Pakistan beyond repair, and could create political crisis that would weaken Obama's presidency and would provide ammunition to Republican critics who questioned his national security credentials. The intelligence that had led to this moment had begun developing in August 2010, when CIA officers tracking one of bin Laden's most trusted couriers, a man known as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, whose real identity had been discovered through interrogations of al-Qaeda detainees and through signals intelligence, had traced him to a large compound in Abbottabad, a city about 35 miles north of Islamabad, that hosted Pakistani military academy, and that seemed unlikely location for world's most wanted terrorist, precisely because its prominence as military city made it seem too obvious for someone attempting to hide. The compound that CIA surveillance had identified was unusual in ways that aroused suspicion. It had 12-foot-high walls topped with barbed wire. It had few windows facing outward. It burned its trash rather than putting it out for collection. It had no telephone or internet connections, despite being large and expensive property. And it housed a family on the third floor that never left the compound and that exercised only in enclosed courtyard where they could not be observed from outside. The intelligence case that bin Laden was living in the Abbottabad compound was based on accumulation of circumstantial evidence rather than on definitive proof, creating analytical challenge that would preoccupy Obama and his advisors for months as they debated whether evidence was strong enough to justify military operation. CIA analysts estimated with varying confidence levels ranging from 40% to 95% that bin Laden was in the compound, the wide range reflecting genuinely different assessments of how to weigh evidence and how to account for possibility that elaborate security measures might be protecting some other high-value target rather than bin Laden himself. The lack of photographic confirmation or signals intelligence from inside the compound meant that even CIA's most confident analysts could not claim certainty, creating a situation where Obama would need to make decision based on judgment about acceptable level of risk rather than on basis of conclusive evidence. The meetings Obama held in the Situation Room during March and April 2011 to discuss options for dealing with the Abbottabad compound revealed the complex decision-making process and the conflicting advice Obama received from senior advisors who assessed risks and benefits differently. The options that were presented included doing nothing and continuing surveillance in hopes of gathering more definitive intelligence, launching drone strike or cruise missile attack that would destroy compound but would not provide confirmation that bin Laden had actually been killed, conducting joint operation with Pakistani military that would respect Pakistani sovereignty but would risk compromise if elements within Pakistan warned bin Laden, or launching unilateral American raid using special operations forces that would maximize chances of confirming bin Laden's identity and of capturing intelligence materials from compound, but would violate Pakistani sovereignty and would risk American casualties if operation went wrong. Vice President Biden, according to multiple accounts from participants, argued against launching the raid, expressing concern that intelligence was not strong enough to justify risks and that failed operation would be devastating to Obama's presidency and to American credibility. Biden's position reflected his generally cautious approach to military operations and his concern about unintended consequences, but it also reflected legitimate uncertainty about whether bin Laden was actually in the compound and about whether operation could succeed without Pakistani cooperation. Secretary of Defense Gates, who had served as CIA director and who had extensive experience with intelligence operations, also expressed reservations about the raid, particularly about using helicopters to insert forces rather than parachuting in, because helicopter approach would take longer and would create more opportunity for Pakistani air defense systems to detect American aircraft and to respond before operation was completed. Secretary of State Clinton, according to her own account and accounts from others present, supported launching the raid despite risks, arguing that opportunity to eliminate bin Laden was too important to pass up and that intelligence, while not conclusive, was strongest lead CIA had developed in nearly a decade of searching. Clinton's position reflected her assessment that political costs of not acting if bin Laden was actually in compound would exceed political costs of failed operation, and that Obama's credibility on national security issues required demonstrating willingness to take calculated risks to achieve strategic objectives. CIA Director Panetta also supported the raid, arguing that his agency had done everything possible to develop intelligence and that waiting for more definitive proof might mean waiting forever if bin Laden maintained operational security that prevented photographic or signals confirmation. The specific words Obama used during these deliberative meetings revealed his analytical approach to decision-making and his determination to consider all perspectives before committing to action. According to participants, Obama repeatedly asked about assumptions underlying intelligence assessments, about what could go wrong during operation, about how Pakistani government might respond if they discovered American forces operating on their territory, and about what would happen if raids succeeded in killing or capturing bin Laden but provoked broader crisis with Pakistan that damaged American interests in Afghanistan, where Pakistani cooperation was essential for supplying NATO forces. I want to understand every way this can fail and every consequence we might face, Obama reportedly said during one meeting, reflecting his preference for comprehensive analysis over hasty action and his recognition that presidential decisions required accepting responsibility for outcomes, including negative consequences that might not be immediately apparent. But Obama also recognized that exhaustive analysis could lead to paralysis and that decisions sometimes needed to be made, despite incomplete information and despite legitimate differences among expert advisors. During meeting on April 28, 2011, after weeks of discussion and debate, Obama interrupted conversation among advisors who were continuing to argue about risks and benefits and said, according to multiple accounts, "This is a decision that I have to make, and I'm not going to make it sitting in this room with all of you. I'm going to go back and think about it." The statement reflected Obama's leadership style that combined collaborative discussion with recognition that ultimate responsibility rested with President alone, and that he needed time and space to think through decision without pressure from advisors advocating their preferred positions. The decision Obama made, communicated to his national security team on April 29th, was to authorize the raid with execution planned for May 1st, when weather conditions would be optimal and when operational security could be maintained. Obama's instructions to Admiral William McRaven, commander of Joint Special Operations Command, who was responsible for planning and executing the operation, were characteristically detailed and specific, according to McRaven's later accounts. Obama wanted confirmation that every contingency had been planned for, that forces were prepared for potential Pakistani military response, that rules of engagement were clear about when force could be used, and that procedures were in place to protect intelligence materials if operation had to be aborted. McRaven later described Obama as completely calm and focused, asking technical questions about helicopter capabilities and about how SEALs would handle various scenarios, while also making clear that final authority to proceed or abort rested with commanders on the ground who would have real-time information that Washington could not access. The tension Obama felt about authorizing the operation was evident to those who worked closely with him in the days before May 1st. His personal aide, Reggie Love, later described Obama as unusually quiet and introspective, understanding that he had ordered young Americans into potentially lethal situation based on intelligence that might be wrong and that failure could cost lives while damaging his presidency in ways that might be politically fatal. The burden of command was something Obama had discussed in various contexts, but the bin Laden operation represented it in concentrated form because decision was entirely his, because risks were enormous, and because there was no way to test whether decision was correct except by implementing it and accepting whatever consequences followed. On the day of the operation, May 1st, Obama's schedule included normal presidential activities, including hosting events at the White House, maintaining public appearance of routine to avoid arousing media speculation about why senior officials were gathering for extended period. The White House Correspondents' Dinner was scheduled for that evening, creating awkward situation where Obama might be delivering humorous remarks at formal dinner while operation was underway or while he was receiving reports about its outcome. The decision was made to proceed with operation on May 1st, despite the dinner commitment, with understanding that Obama would attend the dinner, regardless of operation status, to maintain operational security and to avoid suggesting that something unusual was happening. The gathering in the Situation Room, beginning around 1 p.m., brought together senior officials who had been involved in planning the operation, with video screens showing feeds from drones overhead, providing aerial surveillance of compound, and from camera, on helmet of SEAL team leader, providing ground-level perspective once forces entered the compound. The famous photograph taken during the operation shows Obama and his team watching intently, with Obama leaning forward in his chair at the corner of the table rather than sitting at the head, with Clinton's hand over her mouth in expression of tension, with Biden and Gates and others crowded into the small room waiting for updates from CIA Director Panetta, who was at CIA headquarters in Langley, maintaining communication with McRaven in Afghanistan. The first crisis occurred before SEALs even reached the compound, when one of the helicopters experienced aerodynamic difficulties caused by higher-than-expected temperatures and by compound's high walls that created conditions not fully replicated in training, forcing pilot to make hard landing inside compound that damaged helicopter's tail boom and rendered it unable to fly. The loss of one helicopter meant that mission could not be executed as planned and that contingency procedures for extracting forces would need to be implemented, creating immediate uncertainty about whether operation should continue or should be aborted before SEALs were exposed to additional risk. Obama's first words upon learning of the helicopter crash were, according to Panetta's account, "What happened?" followed by tense silence as officials waited for information about whether crew was injured and whether SEALs could continue with modified plan using the one remaining operational helicopter, plus a backup helicopter that was standing by. McRaven's decision to continue the operation despite helicopter crash reflected confidence in his forces and judgment that mission could still succeed. But it also meant that extraction would be more complicated and that margin for error had narrowed significantly. Obama did not override McRaven's judgment, trusting the commander's assessment that operation could proceed safely, but the helicopter crash had transformed the mood in Situation Room from tension to near dread, as officials contemplated possibility that mission might fail and that SEALs might be trapped inside compound in Pakistani city, surrounded by military installations. The next 40 minutes, from approximately 3:30 p.m. to 4:10 p.m. Washington time, were described by participants as among the longest of their lives as they waited for updates about what was happening inside compound, where SEALs had breached doors and were clearing rooms looking for bin Laden, while officials in Washington could see only aerial view and could hear only fragmentary radio communications that provided limited information about progress. The moment when Panetta relayed message from McRaven that Geronimo, the code name for bin Laden, had been killed came at approximately 3:53 p.m. Washington time, followed minutes later by confirmation that identity had been verified through facial recognition and through other means, and that intelligence materials were being collected from compound before forces withdrew. Obama's response, according to participants, was measured rather than celebratory, saying, "We got him," in quiet voice that reflected relief rather than triumph, understanding that operation had succeeded but that consequences would need to be managed carefully and that announcement would need to be crafted to explain why American forces had conducted military operation in Pakistan without permission. The photograph taken moments after confirmation shows Obama and his team looking relieved but serious, recognizing the gravity of what had just occurred and understanding that killing bin Laden was beginning of new phase rather than conclusion of counterterrorism efforts. The conversation in Situation Room after bin Laden's death was confirmed focused on immediate tactical questions about extracting forces safely and about managing Pakistani reaction when their government discovered what had happened. The decision to destroy the damaged helicopter using explosives to prevent technology from being captured created massive explosion that awoke Abbottabad residents, and that immediately attracted Pakistani military attention, accelerating timeline for extraction and creating risk that Pakistani forces might attempt to intercept American helicopters as they departed Pakistani airspace. Obama's instructions, according to accounts from officials present, were that forces should take whatever time was needed to complete intelligence collection, but should not take unnecessary risks now that primary objective had been achieved. That Pakistani military should be notified of operation as soon as forces were safely out of Pakistani airspace, and that diplomatic communications should emphasize that operation was necessary because of unique circumstances and was not precedent for broader American military operations on Pakistani territory. The extraction of SEALs using backup helicopter that had been waiting at a staging area proceeded without incident despite concerns about Pakistani response, with forces departing Pakistani airspace around 4:30 p.m. Washington time, and proceeding to Afghanistan, where bin Laden's body would be prepared for burial at sea, in accordance with Islamic tradition and with American desire to prevent grave from becoming shrine for extremists. The decision about how to handle bin Laden's body had been discussed extensively before operation, with Obama insisting that religious customs be respected while ensuring that no physical location would exist that could serve as rallying point for al-Qaeda supporters. The address Obama delivered from the White House at 11:35 p.m. on May 1st, announcing bin Laden's death to American public and to the world, was carefully crafted to acknowledge achievement while avoiding triumphalism that might inflame anti-American sentiment or that might suggest that war on terrorism was ending when in fact threats remained. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children. Obama began, speaking from the East Room with measured tone that conveyed gravity rather than celebration. The speech thanked intelligence and military personnel who had made operation possible, acknowledged Pakistani cooperation on counterterrorism while carefully avoiding discussion of whether Pakistan had been informed about the raid, and warned that bin Laden's death did not eliminate terrorist threat but represented justice for September 11th, victims and demonstration that America would pursue enemies, regardless of how long it took or where they attempted to hide. The private words Obama spoke to his team after the address, described in various memoirs and interviews, reflected satisfaction at delivering on campaign promise and at achieving objective that had eluded previous administration, but also recognition that political boost from bin Laden's death would be temporary, and that his presidency would ultimately be judged on broader questions about economy, healthcare, and other domestic priorities that mattered more to most Americans than distant counter-terrorism operations. "We did something important tonight, but we have a lot more work to do," Obama reportedly told senior staff, characteristically tempering celebration with focus on future challenges. What Obama said behind closed doors during the bin Laden operation was that he wanted every contingency planned for and every risk assessed before authorizing mission, that he trusted military commanders to make tactical decisions, but that strategic responsibility rested with him as president, that killing bin Laden was important but was not worth American casualties if operation could not be executed safely, and that success would need to be communicated carefully to avoid inflaming tensions or creating impression that war on terrorism was ending. He said that intelligence community had done remarkable work tracking bin Laden, but that decision to launch raid required accepting uncertainty and trusting judgment rather than waiting for impossible certainty. He said that American forces had performed brilliantly under difficult conditions and that their success vindicated years of preparation and training that enabled Special Operations Forces to execute complex missions in hostile territory. But Obama also expressed, in private conversations after operation was complete, awareness that killing bin Laden did not address underlying conditions that motivated terrorism and did not eliminate al-Qaeda or affiliated groups that continued to threaten American interests worldwide. The question of whether bin Laden's death represented strategic victory or merely symbolic achievement would remain subject to debate, as al-Qaeda evolved into decentralized movement and as new terrorist organizations, including ISIS, emerged posing threats that in some ways exceeded those posed by bin Laden's organization. Obama's later reflection that bin Laden raid represented most important single day of my presidency acknowledged its significance while also implicitly recognizing its limitations as solution to broader problems of terrorism, extremism, and instability in Middle East and South Asia. What bin Laden operation revealed about Obama's leadership style was his preference for thorough analysis before making decisions, his willingness to accept responsibility for risky operations despite political consequences if they failed, his trust in military and intelligence professionals while maintaining civilian control and strategic oversight, and his recognition that success required both courage to act and wisdom to manage consequences of action. The operation's success vindicated Obama's approach and demonstrated that careful planning and professional execution could achieve objectives that had seemed impossibly difficult, but it also revealed the extraordinary convergence of factors: intelligence, technology, training, luck, required for such operations to succeed, and the impossibility of replicating such success consistently across the full range of national security challenges facing the United States in an era of persistent conflict and evolving threats.